Hi, everyone.
Hey,
Hi, welcome back to Bright Lights Beyond.
The grave.
it's getting creepier every time.
I love it. I think it's getting more beyond the grave like.
Yeah.
So
Speaking of, what'd you guys think of the last episode? Because we were super into it. I listened to it like three times. So
I did too. My cousins and I listened to it on the way to the beach, and it really got me in the mood for
go,
the beach.
what did it get you in the mood for? That Norwegian ritual of lighting on fire and going down?
Yes, the Norwegian one, the the mummification process, all of it. It got me prepared, uber prepared.
You're ready to go now.
I was like in the grave.
So we've kind of figured out what to do with your body, your physical body. But you know what we haven't talked about is anything to do with the spirit. So that's kind of like its own huge thing, right?
100%. We are all going to get really well acquainted with the spirit realm and crossing over and what happens if we do or don't cross over properly. Like we were talking about last episode, we talked about the body and burials and death. One thing that we did not really touch on was what happens to our spirits after we physically die. And in the spirit of the holiday coming up and the possible Oscar winner, The Banshees of Inisherin, I looked into banshees and what they do. So, banshees are commonly referred to as the messengers of death. So, they're found in Celtic mythology. Celtic mythology is known kind of worldwide because of its like mythical creatures and its strong ties to the forest, like, centaurs and fairies and elves, and different things like that. But not all parts of this folklore is good, light, or like happy. It's mainly presented in Irish folklore. But banshees are said to be like evil or dark creatures that are part of the fairy family. I don't really like the term evil, but considering what they do, they kind of are like evil fairies. Banshees are said to reside in the dark parts of the forest, the uninhibited parts of the forest, and they're said to resemble tall, thin, pale, white women wearing tattered dresses. And what they're most notably known for is their blood-curdling screams. Have you ever heard the expression, like, you're screaming like a banshee? That expression comes from this creature. And it's said that if you hear the call of the banshee, that means that death is coming for you or it's coming for someone you love. Now, their screams are said to be heard from miles away and can even crack your skull or like rupture your eardrums. And if you hear the banshees cry, that means that death is sure to follow. It's commonly said that if you hear the banshees cry, then that message is intended for you. So whether it's you or a loved one, that message from the banshee is intended for you. And it's said that banshees' eyes glow red because of how often they cry and they scream. And so like a lot of times in, films, movies, and just like books you read about Celtic mythology, you can hear them and see like red glowing eyes. The early origins are kind of with all this kind of stuff in terms of like ancient folklore, origins can change, but it's said that the origins of banshees come from the Celtic god of war, which is Morgan, and it is known to appear. And there are stories of banshees appearing like on battlefields to like, you know, usher these soldiers like into death. Kind of, it's like, hey, you're gonna die, and they show up and they appear. So it's also said that women who have like premonitions are banshees. So it's not always just like the banshees coming for your death, but they also refer to women who have the sight, which is like premonitions, are banshees because they're able to predict events. And a lot of times when you're predicting events, not all the time is it like a good thing. You're not like, hey girl, you're gonna get $50 for your birthday. It's like, no, you're gonna die. Like, be aware. So over time, banshees have evolved into what we think of like souls hanging around castles or graveyards or like haunted women, just around. And it's often referred to or depicted with having owls around them because owls and birds are seen as like a death creature. And the sound of a banshee kind of resembles the sound of like an owl, like totally freaking out and crying. in more modern times are looking into it, banshees are said to follow families around, and each family could possibly have a banshee. And a lot of times it is like a banshee who is maybe a fallen loved one, and it's there to like welcome your loved one into the afterlife. There are two types of banshees in Irish folklore. There is a Caspina, I think that's how you say it, but that's like a friendly banshee in a way, where it's like the song that you may hear is not a screech, it's like a welcoming, and it's like to guide your family member into the afterlife. And it's to give them time. That's what the banshee's cry is, like, it's supposed to give you time. You're supposed to know that you're going to die, maybe 3 days later then you're dead. So it's a time giving thing. The other is a more, I want to say, scary, or I don't know if hateful is a good word, but that banshee is the sound of the cry that you hear. So it varies from different families and different like origins. I know in Scotland it's a different type of banshee where they like wash the clothes of the bloodied loved ones. It's very different. But basically overall, like, banshees are like kind of like the sign of you're gonna die. And this has been told throughout all of Celtic mythology. It's really interesting that these cultures, way even back then, had kind of like an omen of death. We would think of that kind of like a, a grim reaper, or in the Norse culture, they have something called Valkyries, and those people are used to kind of like usher you into Valhalla. So even though like they're not necessarily ushering you anywhere, but it's like a looming presence of death. And so banshees have always, when I've learned about them or heard about them, it's always stuck with me, because they're giving you time, I think, to like, something is going to happen, and it's almost like better that instead of it being a total shock. But yeah, that's kind of what a banshee is.
Okay, so you said there are two different types. So there's ones that are like kinder and typically fallen loved ones. The other ones, they're not like related to you at all, or are they related potentially and they're just like crying out to you like, hey, you're gonna die soon. So it's still like positive, but it's in kind of a more forward and aggressive way.
Yeah. So when looking at those, it seems that like all banshees could be related to you, but the good banshees are people who just like either died young or want to really help you into the afterlife. The more typical banshees you would hear in terms of like, oh my God, I heard this screaming owl type thing and it's going to kill me, is family members who are spiteful, who are jealous of people who are still living. So I mean, and I also think with these types of stories, in terms of like where the banshee's origin, kind of just like where the ghost appears, there's not necessarily like a true and hard fast fact about like where we get this information from, because a lot of it is, not a term I love to use, but pseudoscience, because there's nothing that can prove that. But these
Mhm.
stories have been passed down, and they're so similar throughout cultures that there has to be some teeth behind it. But in my research, that's what I found in terms of banshees, which I thought was really cool, because I thought it was just some random people in the forest, but really, like, it goes back to like the five noble tribes of Ireland, and way, way, way back.
It's interesting that you mention that it's seen in different places around the world because I did some research on the Yurei, which is within the Japanese culture. And it is very different, but also very similar in the fact of like, it's such an interesting type of ritual that you have to perform in order to prepare your loved ones. This is post deceased, so they are dead at this point, but it's still kind of that in between. So, kind of not the same as the banshees, but with banshees, it's like a preparation for death. And this is a preparation for moving on past death. So it's kind of a tradition that the living have to do to help the deceased in order to get to the afterlife. So the Yurei is basically souls that are trapped between the world of the living and the dead. So if you've had a wonderful life and you pass away and your family does this very specific ritual as perfect as possible, you're most likely to move on to the Shinto afterlife. You don't have to worry about your body being in some type of a purgatory. But there are a lot of times when the death is extremely sudden or something happens within the ritual of the family of the deceased that it didn't go quite as planned if they were not a part of the Oban festival, which I will talk about. um, there are a lot of things that could go awry. And then these Yurei kind of are, again, these souls that are kind of trapped between their life and their afterlife. So the biggest thing with these is that they again have had an unnatural death. There was something unresolved within that, and it could have been the unresolved ceremony of the living. It could have been something in their life that it just didn't end as it should have, as it was supposed to. And because of that, their souls won't rest easy until their earthly problems have been solved. So they are said to have had like long black hair and wear white kimonos. And they're like human shapes, but they don't have feet. So if you think of like the traditional ghosts, like a Casper who doesn't have feet, you can kind of think of it similar to this. But they can have deformations depending on like their appearance, like right after they died. So if they got into a car crash and there was something wrong with their body, it was something that they would be carrying over into this purgatory state. And the only way for them to move on from this kind of in between is for the family to perform these rituals in the order and the way that they're supposed to. So I kind of mentioned before, there's a festival called the Oban Festival, and this is kind of a practice within the Buddhist culture, and it's super interesting some of the things that they have to do. I think last episode we kind of talked about the like ofrendas and things that the families do in Mexican culture. What they do in this is house altars, and they set up impaled cucumbers and eggplants to symbolize horses and cows. So they'll basically make, if you think of the eggplant as the body and the cucumbers as the leg, they're creating these, they call them soul cows, and they symbolize taking the soul to the afterlife. Just little things like this are said to really help the soul resolve these kinds of issues that they had on earth and move on to the afterlife. But they can also potentially have a curse. So it says some Yurei are aware of their situation with whom they can dialogue with and even work with the people to have their problems solved. But sometimes there is a ghost tied to the specific place where they are at, and they kind of curse them. So it takes a little bit more to get them kind of to that place of resting. And I just think it's like super interesting. And um, a lot of these like rituals that take place are for the living and for the dead, as far as like helping. I think personally, it's very beneficial to go through this process. I mean, not that you want your body to be or your soul to be in Yurei, but um, it's an interesting way to grieve, I think, and a way for the living to kind of feel like they're helping usher the body into like a more peaceful place, especially if there was something unresolved or it was an untimely death and things like that. It's very interesting. And there's lots of examples. So if you Google, plenty of examples within World War II, there were a lot of fallen soldiers that it happened so drastically that they had to do ritual places, like sacred places to like bury all of these people. And depending on the untimely death, they have you in different locations. So they have specific grave sites for babies who were miscarriages or died at birth. And all of that is very much considered untimely death. So in that way, they put specific places together for people to have resting places. And yeah.
So that's really interesting. I'm wondering, are there any depictions of Yurei in American culture, or do we know of any that are like, it seems like it's almost, they're like a ghost in a way, like stuck between the living and the dead. Is there any like Western, versions of Yuri that we know of?
I think the example of strictly being in purgatory when you have unfinished business left on earth is kind of the example that Western culture uses with ghosts. I mean, sometimes there is a differentiator within the ghosts of, if it's a demon, it's not necessarily a ghost. People when they die and they're not gone to the great beyond, they're considered that kind of in purgatory. But the thing with Western culture is that we don't have rituals to usher from one place to the next. So I think with us, you almost kind of coexist
Mm.
versus helping, unless you're able to communicate, in which case a lot of times mediums would be that bridging the gap. if there was unfinished business with a particular person, you know, like the Long Island medium, or you have other
Teresa
people.
Caputo, love her.
Yes, you have people who help make that transition happen. So I would say that's probably the closest thing that I can think of to this. The problem is they're not, from what I've read, they're not malicious, but they can be scary because it is that very unresolved type of figure. So it's not like a Casper the Friendly Ghost. You'd think of it more as like a terrifying ghost. So a great example would be if you've ever seen the movie The Ring or The Grudge. Both of those are examples of beings that were not able to pass on because of an untimely death. Obviously, with The Ring, it was the little girl. And all she really needed was a little help.
She just needed a hug,
She
y'all.
needed
She
a
just needed a
hug.
hug. And you know what? Now looking at that, I can see how, like, the way she looks, is that what a Yuri looks like?
That's that same thing, like kind of
Okay,
long
wow.
white outfit. I don't know about the feet thing. I mean, I was not focusing on her feet, but it's possible that they weren't there. But that kind of long black hair. Again, it's this kind of very upset being because they don't know what's going on, but they know that there's something that is preventing them from moving on. So obviously they're kind of going to be upset.
And, like you were saying earlier, I think it's so beautiful that they have an entire ritual to help these people cross over. And I guess in a Western culture, or what we're about to talk about next, which I'm excited about, is we don't, beside like exorcists or mediums, like, or people who conduct seances or necromancy, like what do we have that helps like truly usher these spirits, or even like seek them out and find them to like make them go to the next stage of life, which is like the afterlife. Like they're stuck in, like you said, like a purgatory, like a limbo state. Like I think it's so beautiful that in that culture there is a way for these loved ones to get a ritual performed, and then it helps them like cross over. Like that is really comforting. And I wonder, I mean, I'm not like a necromant, I don't know, I'm not like a aficionado on necromancy, so I have no idea if that has anything, or if there's rituals to do in terms for that. But I do find that that's like very very cool, and it kind of reminds me of a psychopump, which is a spirit guide, and they're used to usher in the spirits into the afterlife. So they may not be like living like a medium, or the families in Japan that conduct those ceremonies, but they're like a spirit guide, almost like like we were talking earlier, like almost like a grim reaper, the guy who's like on the river sticks.
Yes, yes, that's right.
Like
That's right.
they kind of usher the people in. And there's different cultures, like we talked about last week, like Anubis, and people who consider themselves Catholic believe that Michael the archangel ushers you into the afterlife. So there are like these different spiritual beings that help your family members, but it's so cool to have like a literal person that's living do that.
Yeah. I also think, like I said earlier, I feel like it's a wonderful way to kind of cope with grief. If you take the afterlife out of it, it's a way to honor your family, which we talked about last week. You're able to like make sure that you've done everything possible to make sure their afterlife is as great as possible.
That is so cool. So we know what happens, I guess, in terms of Yuri like crossing over, or some staying, and we know what it's called, like when you get stuck. And that is a ghost. So a ghost is a spirit or a soul of a dead person or animal that can appear to the living. Ghost lore depictions can, vary depending on like if they're translucent or like ghostly white. Some of them are barely visible and wispy, but we all kind of know what a ghost is. The roots of ghosts actually can be traced back to pre-literate cultures, which are like very, very old. Before we were even able to communicate, there was a term for ghost. In Western culture, especially American culture, ghosts are normally said to haunt people, places, and even things.
So I'm so curious, since we're talking about the reason for banshees and the reason for Yurei, what do you think the reason for ghosts are? Is it to scare the, is it like A Christmas Carol, which the point is to scare you into living your best life? Or is
Yeah.
it truly that you are in a purgatory and you do have unfinished business?
So like we were talking about earlier in terms of like I said, my least favorite word, pseudoscience, but like we were talking about earlier, there's not an exact reason why ghosts are made. But there has been some speculation and there's a list of 10 things that I found that kind of made sense in terms of like what or why ghosts are here. So one of the reasons is an earthbound spirit. And earthbound spirits are just spirits that kind of like you were saying, just are there to either kind of remind people about them or just to like stick around on Earth to give that other dimension to people or objects. That's an earthbound ghost. Another reason could be they don't know that they're dead yet. Which is kind of spooky. Another one is that maybe they are wanting to establish contact with humans. There could be another type that they're in denial, that they are in denial that they're dead. They may know they're dead, but they're like, I'm not really dead. I'm going to stick around. That's kind of like the haunted mansion. Like that man was literally in denial. There could be unfilled desires. And there could be a lack of spiritual connection. So if you live your life in a way that you have no spiritual direction or connection, you could potentially end up as a ghost. Another thing is unfulfilled business, which is kind of like unfulfilled desires, but maybe there was something like a task that you needed to do, like file your W-2. I don't know, but like maybe you forgot to file it and you have to stick around to do that. Another reason could be they're afraid. Another one that I found that made a lot of sense thinking about it is maybe they're guilty about something they happened in their life, like a crime they committed, or maybe they weren't able to like say all they needed to do, but they have some guilt. And then the last reason that I found, which makes a lot of sense and almost like wow, is that maybe there's somebody on earth that doesn't want them to go.
So they're being held back, and the
Yeah.
person on Earth has to figure out their stuff before this other being can move on.
Yeah, so those are the reasons why potentially there could be ghosts. What I found really cool is like the connection. Like, how do we connect to ghosts or like why ghosts appear to us? Do you think it's like primarily just because of like the location we're in, the people we're around, or objects? Like why do ghosts make contact? And what does it mean if we're contacted by a ghost or if we're like see a ghost? Like, what does that mean?
So, no spoilers to our next episode, but I do think there is a correlation between your ability to see and experience supernatural occurrences and your like jadedness to life. So, I feel like more kids are more likely to see stuff because they have this kind of wholesome and willingness to just experience stuff as it's happening. And maybe in those instances, it has nothing to do with the entity itself. It's just they can see stuff better. And animals are the same way. Animals tend to experience a lot more paranormal activity.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way of putting it because I think that as children, we're not so like removed from our spiritual world because we were so close to what that was, like being born. We didn't, we don't really, we know where babies come from. That's not what I'm saying, but you know what I mean? Like we're not so removed from it. And so that makes a lot of sense why people who maybe are sick and dying will see apparitions or people who like are kids or animals, because they're so pure in terms of like, what they live and how connected they are to nature. And that was something when looking into the banshees and even Yurei, like they're connected to nature in a way that we used to be and have now with technology grown a little bit away from. But nature and the forest and the mythical part of where people came from before we knew like about science, like that is what makes these different traditions or spirits, so I don't know, like profound and cool to learn about. And like you were saying, I'm super excited for our next episode. I don't know if you guys know, but we've been behind the scenes asking people who've had encounters with ghosts or spirits. And we're super excited to announce that we have a guest who's had a ghost encounter.
Oh, I wish we would have said we're super excited to announce we have the first ghost on a podcast. One day we'll get there. One day we'll have the
One
cloud
day
enough
we're
for a
having, yeah,
ghost.
we'll have Casper on a mic.
Yeah, so it's very exciting that we're going to be able to talk to somebody who has had an experience. And I feel like a lot of us feel like we maybe had an experience, but don't necessarily know. Because, you do the like Halloween going to, like in Louisville, we used to go to Waverly Hills, which was a big
Ooh.
tuberculosis mansion, and like go to see exactly, where these large groups of people died. But you're like looking for stuff. And I almost feel
Right.
like it has to happen to you for it to be like, yeah, legit.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I've not been to like a tuberculosis ward, which is first of all terrifying and, very, but like it's what we said about a lot of different things in terms of hospital, battlegrounds. I recently with my sister just went to Salem, and although maybe only 25 people were killed in the Salem witch trials, that land, hundreds of people were accused, and that land, not only is it so old in terms of being like where the freaking settlers came, but like that land, there's something so like heavy or mysterious about it. Um, and I know that back in Texas, where we would go was this thing called Cutting Edge, and it was like a 100-year-old, abandoned meat packing factory. And you don't even think about like, yeah, maybe packaging meat in just like the slaughter of like mass amounts of
Animals.
animals can
Yeah.
mar a place.
Mhm.
So I think that is true in terms of like just like the different and a feeling. I don't know. I hope that makes sense. Hope it's translating, but you know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah. So I'm really excited to hear kind of a firsthand account of somebody who definitely experienced something and see maybe then what else,
What
I don't
else
know what to say.
lies beyond the grave,
The
like this
grave.
this is something that's like in between the grave and life. And like we said before about the banshees, in terms of like they are giving a calling sign that there is death looming. And then you have the Yurei, which is death embodied, but like in between the ground and the above the ground. And then you have an actual ghost, which is someone who's stuck. So I'm just super excited to learn more about that. And I hope you guys enjoyed learning about these different cultures and this different practice. I know it's a little bit different than we've done the rest, but with this new angle and just like in the spirit of learning, I hope that this helped, kind of like add a little bit to like there has always been kind of like either calling cards for the afterlife, or there's always been like this in between type area.
Yeah, and I think that there's so much more to learn. Like we've just skimmed the surface
Totally.
because every human, like we said before, experiences death in some way, and we will all actually experience death at some time. And
Right.
so there's so much to uncover.
So much. And we're just so excited for you guys to take this journey with us. And as always, live
Live
life
life beyond.
beyond.